All right, now let's talk a little bit about that financial crisis, the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, which really kicked off the Great Recession. Um, it began with a mortgage default crisis. And so what happened was that, um, again, we'd had, it goes back to a previous recession, right? There was a recession early in the 2000s, and it hit the housing industry. So the Fed decided, let's push down interest rates to help push down mortgage rates to help the housing industry. And it worked. It worked really well. It worked too well, in fact, because this is the time period when it became so cheap to get a mortgage that lots and lots of people were buying houses. And this is when um, we actually started to see the flipping phenomenon. People realized they could get a cheap mortgage, buy a fixer upper, fix it up really quick, and turn around and sell it. And what was going on here is that because interest rates were so low, that created a lot of demand for houses. And so demand for houses increased and supply didn't keep up, so that pushed prices up, right? So that created the situation with prices rising so that you could, buy a house, fix it up, and by the time you fix it up, you could sell it for even more, right? And make a profit. The problem was the housing market, kind of created what we call a bubble. Houses did become overvalued, and eventually, the housing market corrected. And so, when that happened, home prices fell, real estate values started falling, and a lot of people were stuck with loans that the loan was more than what the house was worth. So these people had taken out these huge loans, um, and now they could, if they wanted to sell the house, they wouldn't be able to pay the loan off, right? So we had the low interest rates that got things started. Then the housing market correction created the problem. And at the same time, we had these things called mortgage backed securities um, that had become very popular as investment vehicles. A lot of banks and financial institutions were heavily invested in these mortgage backed securities. And they were based on the idea that people were paying their mortgages. And when the housing market corrected, um, and people started realizing their homes weren't worth what the mortgage was, they started defaulting on their mortgages and they stopped paying their mortgages. And when that happened, the value of these mortgage-backed securities fell, and then it was kind of like dominoes. One domino fell and the rest just started falling. So I do have a video that we're going to watch that I think illustrates this really well. Um, we'll get to that. What was going on here again? The idea of we call securitization. So what they were doing is they're taking all these mortgage loans, they were slicing them up and repackaging them into securities, right? And so as the loans defaulted, the whole system kind of collapsed. Um, so here's the video I was telling you about.
The crisis of credit, visualized. What is the credit crisis? It's a worldwide financial fiasco involving terms you've probably heard, like subprime mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, frozen credit markets, and credit default swaps. Who's affected? Everyone. How did it happen? Here's how. The credit crisis brings two groups of people together: homeowners and investors. Homeowners represent their mortgages, and investors represent their money. These mortgages represent houses, and this money represents large institutions like pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign funds, mutual funds, etc. These groups are brought together through the financial system, a bunch of banks and brokers commonly known as Wall Street. While it may not seem like it, these banks on Wall Street are closely connected to these houses on Main Street. To understand how, let's start at the beginning. Years ago, the investors are sitting on their pile of money, looking for a good investment to turn into more money. Traditionally, they go to the U.S. Federal Reserve, where they buy Treasury bills, believed to be the safest investment. But In the wake of the dot-com bust in September 11th, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan lowers interest rates to only 1% to keep the economy strong. 1% is a very low return on investment, so the investors say no thanks. On the flip side, this means banks on Wall Street can borrow from the Fed for only 1%. Add to that general surpluses from Japan, China, and the Middle East, and there's an abundance of cheap credit. This makes borrowing money easy for banks and causes them to go crazy with leverage. Leverage is borrowing money to amplify the outcome of a deal. Here's how it works. In a normal deal, someone with $10,000 buys a box for $10,000. He then sells it to someone else for $11,000 for a $1,000 profit, a good deal. But using leverage, someone with $10,000 would go borrow $990,000 more dollars, giving him $1 million in hand. Then he goes and buys 100 boxes with his $1 million and sells them to someone else for $1,100,000. Then he pays back his $990,000 plus $10,000 in interest. And after his initial $10,000, he's left with a $90,000 profit versus the other guy's $1,000. Leverage turns good deals into great deals. This is a major way banks make their money. So Wall Street takes out a ton of credit, makes great deals, and grows tremendously rich, and then pays it back. The investors see this and want a piece of the action, and this gives Wall Street an idea. They can connect the investors to the homeowners through mortgages. Here's how it works. A family wants a house, so they save for a down payment and contact a mortgage broker. The mortgage broker connects the family to a lender who gives them a mortgage. The broker makes a nice commission. The family buys a house and becomes homeowners. This is great for them because housing prices have been rising practically forever. Everything works out nicely. One day, the lender gets a call from an investment banker who wants to buy the mortgage. The lender sells it to him for a very nice fee. The investment banker then borrows millions of dollars and buys thousands more mortgages and puts them into a nice little box. This means that every month he gets the payments from the homeowners of all the mortgages in the box. Then he sicks his banker wizards on it to work their financial magic, which is basically cutting it into 3 slices: safe, okay, and risky. They pack the slices back up in the box and call it a collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. A CDO works like 3 cascading trays. As money comes in, the top tray fills first, then spills over into the middle, and whatever is left into the bottom. The money comes from homeowners paying off their mortgages. If some owners don't pay and default on their mortgage, less money comes in and the bottom tray may not get filled. This makes the bottom tray riskier and the top tray safer. To compensate for the higher risk, the bottom tray receives a higher rate of return, while the top receives a lower, but still nice return. To make the top even safer, banks will insure it for a small fee called a credit default swap. The banks do all of this work so that credit rating agencies will stamp the top slice as a safe AAA rated investment, the highest, safest rating there is. The OK slice is BBB, still pretty good, and they don't bother to rate the risky slice. Because of the AAA rating, the investment banker can sell the safe slice to the investors who only want safe investments. He sells the OK slice to other bankers and the risky slices to hedge funds and other risk takers. The investment banker makes millions. He then repays his loans. Finally, the investors have found a good investment for their money, much better than the 1% treasury bills. They're so pleased they want more CDO slices. So the investment banker calls up the lender, wanting more mortgages. The lender calls up the broker for more homeowners, but the broker can't find anyone. Everyone that qualifies for a mortgage already has one, but they have an idea. When homeowners default on their mortgage, the lender gets the house, and houses are always increasing in value. Since they're covered if the homeowners default, lenders can start adding risk to new mortgages, not requiring down payments, no proof of income, no documents at all. And that's exactly what they did. So instead of lending to responsible homeowners, called prime mortgages, they started to get some that were, well, less responsible. These are subprime mortgages. This is the turning point. So, just like always, the mortgage broker connects the family with a lender and a mortgage, making his commission. The family buys a big house. The lender sells the mortgage to the investment banker, who turns it into a CDO and sells slices to the investors and others. This actually works out nicely for everyone and makes them all rich. No one was worried because as soon as they sold the mortgage to the next guy, it was his problem. If the homeowners were to default, they didn't care. They were selling off their risk to the next guy and making millions, like playing hot potato with a time bomb. Not surprisingly, the homeowners default on their mortgage, which at this moment is owned by the banker. This means he forecloses and one of his monthly payments turns into a house. No big deal. He puts it up for sale. But more and more of his monthly payments turn into houses. Now there are so many houses for sale on the market, creating more supply than there is demand, and housing prices aren't rising anymore. In fact, they plummet. This creates an interesting problem for homeowners still paying their mortgages. As all the houses in their neighborhood go up for sale, the value of their house goes down, and they start to wonder why they're paying back their $300,000 mortgage when the house is now worth only $90,000. They decide that it doesn't make sense to continue paying, even though they can afford to, and they walk away from their house. Default rates sweep the country, and prices plummet. Now the investment banker is basically holding a box full of worthless houses. He calls up his buddy, the investor, to sell his CDO, but the investor isn't stupid and says, no thanks. He knows that the stream of money isn't even a dribble anymore. The banker tries to sell to everyone, but nobody wants to buy his bomb. He's freaking out because he borrowed millions, sometimes billions of dollars to buy this bomb, and he can't pay it back. Whatever he tries, he can't get rid of it. But he's not the only one. The investors have already bought thousands of these bombs. The lender calls up trying to sell his mortgage, but the banker won't buy it, and the broker is out of work. The whole financial system is frozen, and things get dark. Everybody starts going bankrupt. But that's not all. The investor calls up the homeowner and tells him that his investments are worthless. And you can begin to see how the crisis flows in a cycle. Welcome to the crisis of credit.
So, again, I think that video does a much better job of illustrating the crisis than anything I could say. But so the big mortgage holders, those big banks and financial institutions, and particularly mortgage banks, got into trouble because they held a lot of these mortgage-backed securities. Um, Countrywide and Washington Mutual were two that were mortgage banks. That's what they did. Um, so, um, they were both saved from bankruptcy by other banks who bought them out. Um, Wachovia was another one. And then a lot of other firms came close, right? So, um, as the direct mortgage lenders got into trouble, then those troubles started to spread to other financial institutions, and that's when we started having some of these, more generalized financial institutions come into the Fed to take out some of those emergency loans that we talked about. So, what did we do about it? Well, Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP, in 2008 to try and save the financial institutions that were affected by the crisis. They allocated $700 billion to make emergency loans. They did save several institutions from failure. They did bail some out. The problem with bailing out financial institutions, though, is that it made it almost acceptable to continue the risky behavior. We call that moral hazard. And so that was very controversial even while they were doing it. So the Congress is bailing banks out, and then again we had the Fed acting as lender of last resort. And they undertook a number of different actions. You're not going to be held responsible for all these individually. I just want you to get a sense of the scope of what was going on. So first, they started the Primary Dealer Credit Facility, which was lending money to those primary dealers, the ones that were directly involved in the buying and selling of those government bonds that made monetary policy possible. So you notice in the video they talked about a credit freeze, credit markets freezing up, and that the Fed needed to ensure that those dealers who were buying and selling the government bonds for them were still going to be there. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do anything. We had the Term Securities Lending Facility. Then this was about ensuring propping up markets for longer-term securities. Asset-backed commercial paper money market mutual fund liquidity facility. This was about then widening the scope, if you will, to money market mutual funds and propping up those markets. Commercial paper funding facility. This is about corporations that issue bonds. That's one way corporations can borrow money, and so they added some liquidity to those markets. The money market investor funding facility. Again, now we're getting more into some markets that we as consumers might have money invested in. The term asset-backed securities loan facility. This would be things more like moving into like the mortgage markets. And then one of the other things they did that has now become very important is they started paying interest on reserves. So we talked about reserves earlier. That's the money that banks have to hold on to. They can hold that money in their vault, or they can hold it in their account at the Fed. And most of the time, they're holding it in their account at the Fed. But prior to 2008, it just sat there. They weren't earning any interest on it. So initially, when the Fed started paying interest on reserves, it was just a way to get some additional money to banks who were struggling. It was kind of a desperate attempt. Here, let's give you some money. We're going to see that has now evolved and has become the primary tool of monetary policy. But again, we'll talk about that in Chapter 16. So the other thing that happened during this financial crisis is we had a lot of consolidation in the industry. So as these banks were, coming close to failing, getting bought up by other banks, we had the surviving banks got a lot bigger, right? And we also had some lines become blurred between the different types of institutions. So more than 200 banks were shut down by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and their assets were transferred to other banks. So a lot of consolidation. Some investment banks opted to become commercial banks because at the time commercial banks were really the only ones who were allowed to take out those emergency loans from the Fed. So what we had was we had some different types of financial institutions develop that weren't part of the Federal Reserve System, so they couldn't get those emergency loans, and yet they were invested in those mortgage-backed securities. So um, we had some of those types of institutions convert to commercial banks so that then they could become part of the Federal Reserve System. We had insurance companies. Again, insurance companies were very highly invested in these mortgage-backed securities, and now they were struggling. Those mutual fund companies, pension funds, that's another one. Pension funds, um, we have a teacher pension fund in the state of Texas. Major municipalities will have pension funds for their police department, fire department. Again, these types of entities were also very highly invested in these mortgage-backed securities. And again, securities firms that dealt primarily in government securities. All of these categories of financial institutions were hit, and again, what we saw was some conversion, some consolidation. It just the industry really changed pretty dramatically. So this slide here is going to give you a good sense of the different categories of financial institutions, a description, and then some examples. So we're pretty familiar with commercial banks, right? You may have an account with Chase or Bank of America or Wells Fargo. And then those thrifts, right? Savings and loans, again, we don't have that many of those anymore. Mutual savings banks, credit unions. A lot of us have accounts with credit unions. DACU is one in our area. Insurance companies, again, these would be some of the big names here: Prudential, New York Life, Northwestern Mutual, and Hartford. The mutual fund companies, this is the firms that take all of our money and pull them together to buy stocks and bonds, so that we may not be able to buy individual stock for Apple, but if we combine our money with other people, then we can take that money and buy Apple stocks, and then we all get a portion of that, right? So those would be companies like Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, some of those. Pension funds, again, TIAA-CREF is a fund that has traditionally been associated with teacher pensions. The Teamsters Union, they have their own pension funds. CalPERS, that's the California pension fund. So again, the idea is that I pay into teacher retirement every time every paycheck they take out money that goes into teacher retirement. Then the teacher retirement fund in Texas invests that money, and then when I retire, I'm going to get my retirement benefits from that. So you can start to see the problem. If pension funds were holding a bunch of these mortgage-backed securities, and all of a sudden those were worthless, then how are they going to pay retirement benefits, right? Securities firms, again, these are the ones that buy and sell stocks and bonds for clients. Merrill Lynch, Charles Schwab, some of those, again, they were holding, and their clients were holding a lot of these mortgage-backed securities. And then investment banks, these are the firms that actually, they don't work with individuals like us, they work with corporations and governments to sell stocks and bonds. So all of these different types of financial institutions were hit by this crisis with mortgage-backed securities. So, how has this shaken out? Well, one of the things that happened was we had a lot of new regulation, right? We had the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And again, this was passed to help prevent a lot of the things that led to the crisis. But it was highly criticized because regulation is very costly, right? And we've talked about that before, back about when we talked about aggregate supply, right? We know that regulation adds costs that aren't associated with productive activity. So while we think it's important to regulate for consumer protection, there were a lot of people who basically said this one went too far. And this is also when we started talking about firms being too big to fail, right? You may have heard that. And there's, so we also had the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act being part of this process. And under that act, we had the opportunity to criminally prosecute HSBC Bank. They were accused of laundering money for the Sinaloa drug cartel. But at the time, the Assistant U.S. Attorney General made the decision to fine the company instead of criminally prosecute them. They could have criminally prosecuted them under this act, but instead they just fined them. And the reason was that they were afraid that a criminal prosecution might lead to the collapse of the company, and that would have a negative effect on the economy. So this is the idea of being too big to fail, right? That we have these entities that are so large that if they fail, they might take the entire economy down with them. So this was another part of what we tried to do, is we tried to, look at situations where we could take these big financial firms and break them up into smaller entities, that then if those smaller entities failed, it wouldn't affect the entire financial system. But that really hasn't gone very far. So we still live in a world where we have these large financial institutions that basically that kind of gives them some power, right? If they get into trouble, they can go to the U.S. government and say, hey, bail us out or we're taking down your economy, right? And so this is an ongoing issue, and this is something we continue to be concerned about. It caused a lot of problems back in 2007, 2008, and it still kind of looms over us today.